Hi, everybody. Some love stories don't end when everything falls apart. They begin there. The journey of Toan and Lytudiep is one of rebuilding, piece by fragile piece, a love shattered by lost memories and unspoken pain. What was once familiar became distant, and what was once certain had to be chosen all over again. As Toan struggles to reclaim the past, Lytudiep walks beside him, carrying both hope and heartbreak. Every step forward is uncertain, every moment together a test of faith. Yet, in the ruins of what they lost, a deeper love quietly takes shape, one born not from memory, but from courage and devotion. Because when love is broken, the journey to rebuild it reveals how strong it truly is. Some places never truly leave us. They wait, quietly, patiently, holding pieces of who we once were. For Toan and Lytudiep, that place was a small, modest restaurant tucked into a familiar street, where years ago they had shared their very first meal together. On that afternoon, as they stood across the road looking at the faded sign, neither of them spoke. The past seemed to breathe between them. Toan hesitated before stepping forward. His recovery had been steady, but moments like this still felt fragile, as if one wrong step could shatter everything. The scent of food drifting from inside reached him first, warm, comforting, strangely intimate. His chest tightened. He couldn't yet name every memory, but his heart reacted faster than his mind. Lytudiep noticed the way his fingers curled slightly, a silent sign of both fear and excitement. When they entered, the bell above the door rang softly, just as it always had. A few customers glanced up, then returned to their meals. At first, no one recognized them. Life continued in its ordinary rhythm, spoons clinking, quiet conversations, a child laughing somewhere near the back. Yet there was something about the way Toan and Diem stood close together that drew subtle attention, as if they carried a story too heavy to ignore. They chose the same table by the window. Lytudiep had not planned it, but her feet led her there naturally. Toan ran his hand along the edge of the table, a faint smile touching his lips. "I feel like I've sat here before," he murmured. Her heart skipped, but she only nodded, afraid that hope might rush ahead of reality. As they settled in, whispers began. An older woman near the counter stared a little longer than necessary. A waiter paused, frowning slightly, as though searching his memory. Something about this couple felt familiar. Something about their quiet closeness made the room softer. Outside, traffic moved on, unaware of the quiet storm unfolding inside. Toon lifted the menu, his hands steady, his eyes curious. Lytudiep watched him carefully, knowing that this meal was more than a return. It was a test of memory, of love, and of whether the past, once broken, could gently be touched again without falling apart. Recognition rarely arrives all at once. It comes in fragments, hesitation in the eyes, a pause in movement, a whisper that lingers too long. As Toan and Lytudiep sat quietly at their table, the air in the restaurant began to shift. The waiter, who had paused earlier, returned, standing a little straighter now, his gaze fixed on Toan's face. There was something unmistakably familiar there. "Excuse me," he said carefully, lowering his voice. "Have you been here before?" Toan looked up surprised, then glanced at Lytudiep. She smiled politely. "Yes," she answered for them both, "a long time ago." The waiter's expression softened. Memory clicked into place. He remembered the young man who once laughed too loudly, and the woman who always listened more than she spoke. Word traveled quietly from table to table. The owner emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, her eyes widening as she stared. "It's really you," she said, disbelief and warmth mixing in her voice. Whispers followed. Not cruel, not curious in a shallow way, but full of concern and wonder. People had heard the story. The successful CEO who vanished from public life. The woman who stayed when leaving would have been easier. Seeing them now, together, calm, present, felt like watching a miracle dressed in ordinary clothes. Toan sensed the attention and shifted uncomfortably. For a brief moment, doubt crept in. Did he belong here? Did he deserve the quiet admiration in their eyes? Lytudiep reached across the table and squeezed his hand, grounding him. Her touch reminded him that this moment wasn't about the crowd. It was about them. The owner insisted on serving their table herself. She placed the dishes down gently, as if setting something sacred. "You're back," she said, smiling through moist eyes. Toan nodded, unsure why emotion rose so quickly in his chest. He felt gratitude without fully understanding its roots. Around them, the restaurant felt different, warmer, slower. Conversations softened. A woman nearby wiped her eyes. Someone whispered, "Love like that still exists." Toan looked at Lytudiep then, really looked at her. And though his memories were still imperfect, one truth felt clear. Whatever they had lost, they were now being quietly welcomed back, not just into this restaurant, but into a story people believed in again. And sometimes, that belief was enough to keep moving forward. Time has a strange way of folding in on itself. Sitting at that familiar table, Toan felt as though the past and present were quietly sharing the same breath. The plates arrived, steam rising gently, carrying scents that wrapped around his senses before his thoughts could catch up. The aroma stirred something deep, comfort, hunger, and a tenderness he could not yet fully explain. Lytudiep watched him closely, her heart moving between hope and restraint. She had learned not to rush him, not to pull at memories before they were ready. When Toan lifted his chopsticks, his hand paused midair. His eyes narrowed slightly, as if listening to an echo only he could hear. "I used to order this," he said slowly, almost questioning himself. "Didn't I?" Her breath caught. "Yes," she answered softly, "every time." The room seemed to lean in. Though no one openly stared anymore, a shared awareness lingered, an unspoken understanding that something delicate was unfolding. Toan tasted the food carefully, as though flavor itself might unlock a door. Suddenly, a flash. Laughter spilling across the table, Diem scolding him for eating too fast, the rain outside tapping impatiently on the glass. His head throbbed, but he didn't pull away. "I remember waiting for you here," he said, voice low. "You were late. You always were." Lytudiep laughed, startled and teary. The sound felt like release. "And you pretended to be angry, but you never were." Emotion rose and fell between them, quiet but powerful. Toan realized then that memory was not just about images, it was about feeling, about the way his chest tightened when she smiled, about the peace he felt simply sitting across from her, sharing a meal. Around them, everyday life continued. A couple argued softly near the door, someone dropped a spoon. Ordinary sounds grounded the extraordinary moment. This wasn't a dramatic recovery or a sudden miracle. It was slow, human, imperfect. Toan reached across the table, his hand trembling slightly. "Even if I forget again," he said, "I want to sit here with you again and again." Lytudiep nodded, tears sliding freely now. She understood what he meant. Memory might fade, but choosing each other, over meals, over silence, over ordinary days, was something they could always do. And at that table, where time once paused, love quietly learned how to move forward again. There are moments so quiet that they change everything. As Toan and Lytudiep finished their meal, the restaurant no longer felt like a public place. It had become a shared space of memory, patience, and silent respect. No one interrupted them. Even the clatter of dishes seemed to soften, as if the room itself understood the weight of what was happening. Toan leaned back slightly, exhaling as though he had just completed a long journey. His eyes traveled around the room, taking in the faces that now felt strangely familiar. He didn't remember all of them, but he sensed their kindness. Their reactions were not loud or dramatic. Instead, they were filled with something rarer: recognition without judgment. An elderly man near the window raised his cup in a small, respectful gesture. A young woman at the next table smiled openly, no attempt to hide the tears in her eyes. The owner approached once more, placing 2 cups of warm tea on their table. "On the house. For new beginnings," she said gently. Toan nodded, touched more deeply than he could explain. Outside, dusk settled over the street. People passed by, unaware that inside, a love story was being quietly reaffirmed. Lytudiep stood to pay the bill, but Toan stopped her. He took out his wallet, his movements confident, grounded. It was a small act, but to those watching, it meant everything. He was present. He was choosing. As they prepared to leave, the bell above the door rang again. This time, it sounded brighter. Several customers watched them go, their eyes following not a famous CEO, but a man and a woman who had survived something ordinary people feared most: forgetting each other. On the sidewalk, Toan paused and looked at Lytudiep. "I don't remember every detail," he said honestly, "but I know how this feels." He placed a hand over his chest. "And I don't want to lose it." Lytudiep smiled through her tears. She had never asked for perfection, only sincerity. As they walked away together, blending back into the flow of everyday life, the people behind them returned to their meals, quietly carrying the story with them. Some stories don't need applause. Sometimes being witnessed is enough.